So the first thing that I did is look on Mixamo and grab a character. I also went onto Sketchfab and looked around until I found a nice gun model. So I've got the SWAT guy here, and we've got the gun here, and we've got a camera here having an incredibly low focal length for the camera of only 12mm. And so that means that the field of view is essentially just very, very high. I'm also rendering in 1920 by 810, which is noticeably wider than the standard 1080p, just to make it feel a bit more like a helmet cam or something akin to what a human would be seeing. And the first step is to animate the arms, hands, fingers, and the gun. And this is what takes most of the time, and it takes a lot of fine tuning to get down. This isn't a fully detailed step-by-step tutorial, but I'll go over general steps that should be taken. First, we can take the rifle and we can select a bone to parent it to. This will mean that when we move our hand, our gun moves with our hand. And I wasn't exactly sure how to tackle the next bit, but what I ended up doing is completely separately animating the magazine just coming out of the gun, and then I animated the hand as best as I could to move with it. And once both of them were in place roughly, then I fine-tuned both of the animations of the fingers and also of the magazine movement to make it look like it really was being held. I still think it looks sort of rough, but I'm happy with it for my first magazine removal animation. For the firing animation, there's a bit more going into it than just basic movement of the gun, but we just have a few keyframes to tell the gun to very violently move upwards over a few frames and then come back down again. And that's just by animating the movement of the hand holding the gun. The movement of the initial recoil is much faster, as you can see in these keyframes here, than the recovery, because the recovery is meant to be something a bit more natural and less mechanical. And then we simply maneuver the gun and the arms very close to the camera, and we get a aim down sight perspective, and we just animate similar movements of the gun's recoil. After the aim down sight firing, we return to our original position so that it can loop nicely. The next thing we can do is, using the graph editor, we can add some noise to the animation, or random erratic movement, which is very subtle, but I think it adds some realism because we can't hold any sort of heavy object perfectly still. And we can also add, using the same technique, shuddering to the camera, and we get camera shake. If we select the camera, we can see illustrated by the funny squiggly lines the noise that has been added to emulate camera shake, or just the way that your head wobbles around a little bit in real life, I guess. I just wanted to add this shakiness and imperfection to the animation in general to try and make it feel less sterile or scripted. And you can see with each gunshot, this front line kind of represents how zoomed in it is, and you can see that with each gunshot we zoom out a fair bit, but it's meant to sort of emphasize the recoil. There was something that I thought of last minute and decided to add spontaneously, and I'm really glad that I did. Okay, now it is time to have fun. Now we're adding effects. And so, as you can see here, we've got our muzzle flash, but plot twist, the muzzle flash is a flat plane which is playing a video of a muzzle flash on it, which I downloaded off of YouTube. It's very brief and it's only lasting 2 frames, and so as long as it's oriented to face the camera and doesn't look weird and distorted, then I think it works alright. And I've got the emission from the image bumped up enough that we are getting realistic lighting on our gun here. I also snatched a bullet model and I cut off the bullet and just left it as an empty bullet shell, and then I just animated this for a couple of frames and then disappearing again. I also animated the finger pulling the trigger. I added this object which is highlighted in orange, which is essentially meant to map the focus of the camera, and I've got here a very amateurish 3-point lighting setup. Without these 3, we actually do have quite a dark overall scene, and the gun is pretty shrouded in shadow. I worked on the textures of the gun and also of the person's hands because I do not believe that they were meant to be viewed at such a close-up angle. Most of what I did was mess around with the normal maps, which simulate some sort of depth and lighting on the guns. As you can see, if I take this off, we lose a lot of our nice detail and imperfection on the gun. I also gave similar treatment to the hands of the soldier. And the final thing is to render it, which I just left on in the background for a couple of hours while I was doing homework. I add some bloom, but I turned up the glare threshold to simulate the camera's exposure being a little bit lower because of the fact we're looking up at a bright sky. I also added some subtle lens distortion, but as you can see if I crank this a bit, we get some very harsh chromatic aberration on the edge of the camera. But the way that I work is that if it's not noticeable, then why add it? So I usually crank stuff a little bit higher than is necessarily realistic or needed. I also added some barrel distortion to simulate either a GoPro or just the human eye, I feel like has a bit of bendiness to its aperture. I also added a tiny bit of blur, which I think helps smooth out some rough edges, quite literally. So I've got all of our frames rendered now. If we go into DaVinci Resolve with our final footage, we can do some color grading. Oh man, this looks like a Call of Duty thumbnail now. The main thing that we are here to add is audio. So what I did is I sourced the inspiration of this video. Essentially all that we need is gun noises and some ambient wind noises, and if you want some breathing noises, possibly some bullet whizzing sound effects, but everything is really up to you at this point. Just take your own artistic liberty here. Thank you very much for watching. This was meant to be a 1-minute video, so I've recorded for half an hour, Jesus.